Well, I won't talk very long tonight. One of the things I'm most passionate about in life is getting 8 hours of Z's, and I don't think anyone's schedule should be disrupted in order to hear what I have to say, including me. So, if I have a topic, I'm hell on wheels, but I didn't really have a topic tonight. It was sort of general remarks. I was very interested in what Jonathan said. It reminded me of just how thoroughly alienated you can be if you come out of Berkeley, because to my mind, you just can't run as a headline the news that America is run by subhuman jerks. It's been Article 1 in my assumptions about how society works for about 25 years. It is puzzling, though, because since 1982, I've been advocating 5 grams in silent darkness, heroic doses, so forth and so on. And by the simple subterfuge of using big words, I've been able to slip through not only unscathed, but uncriticized, as far as I can tell, by these same half-wit nincompoops whose crimes were detailed earlier. My notion of how all this works is not different in conclusion, but different in approach, I think, because I always tend to try and go for the big picture. And I'm very interested in the human condition generally and how we ever got to this moment. When you look at the rest of nature, there's just nothing in it like ourselves. And I think, if this planet were devoid of human life and civilization, but had its full complement of rhesus monkeys, coral reefs, glaciers, volcanoes, and so forth, that the kinds of ideas that were developed in the 19th century by Darwin and the people who followed after him would be generally adequate to explain the situation. The astonishing natural product is humanity and the civilization that it has created. And short of some kind of religious explanation, that we are the product of God's generosity or something like that, which isn't very satisfying to a scientist, and I number myself on the outer fringes of that loathed minority. The human experience represents something entirely different, and so to explain ourselves, we have to reach for some kind of an extraordinary explanation, not only to explain, our poetry and our soaring cathedrals and so forth, but also the way in which we shame the animal kingdom by our cruelty, our brutality to one another, our perfection of forms of lethal behavior that are on a scale unimaginable in the animal world. And my explanation of how this circumstance comes to be has, by dint of what I think is intellectual fairness and other people call quirky happenstance, come to rest fairly strongly on these consciousness-altering substances that are so important to all of us here. And I think briefly what I want to say about it tonight, and I can go into it in more detail in private conversations or later, but here's the snapshot version of how it works. All primates form what are called dominance hierarchies. This means that the long-fanged, hard-bodied young males of primate species control the females, the juveniles, and the older members of the social grouping. And this is a general phenomenon in primates. It reaches clear down to squirrel monkeys and from the higher primates to the lowest of the primates. And as we sit here tonight, it functions in us as well. This is what gender politics is all about. This is what power politics is all about. This is what racism can be traced to, and so forth. So, and yet, somehow, at some point in time, there was a temporary suspension of this tendency in our species. It's a behavior. It's not an organ. It's not scripted into our physiology. It's simply a behavior, like language, which is also a behavior, and a behavior which makes a tremendous symmetry break with the rest of nature. And I think that in order to explain the presence of language and the presence of our complexity, we're going to have to hypothesize an unusual set of circumstances acting only in our species as far as we can tell. Now, it's known that alkaloids generally, in low doses, have the peculiar quality of increasing visual acuity. This is, it's not understood why this is, but it was very well documented in the late 50s and early 60s at NIMH by Roland Fisher, who started his scientific career as an ophthalmologist, that psilocybin increases visual acuity. And I think that the centrality of the phenomenon of addiction in human beings is a clue to our origins, or the origins of what we call humanness. Ron Siegel was at great pains to inform us that elephants will push down walls to get to rotting papaya, and so forth and so on, and to try and imply then that fascination with altered states was a general characteristic of the animal, of mammals, let's say. Or he also talked about the birds and the bees. That's true to a degree, but in a way it muddies the waters, because human beings are obsessively addictive to all kinds, not only of substances, but of situations, of each other, of localities, of ideologies. I mean, you can hardly name a category of experience that we do not form obsessive and addictive relationships to. I mean, a guy steps to his front door in the morning and opens the door. If the daily newspaper isn't lying rolled at his feet, he slams the door and walks back into his house, now a menace to wife and child, quite simply because an addictive behavior has been interrupted by the unexpected withdrawal of the object of the addiction. And we see this in many, many situations. Well, I think that in order to understand what Lumholtz, who was an evolutionary biologist, called the single most dramatic expansion of an organ of a higher animal in the entire record of evolutionary existence, the doubling, nearly tripling in size of the human brain in about a 2.5 million year period, in order to understand the presence of language and technology and its rapid exfoliation in our species, in order to understand our tendency to addict to all kinds of substances and situations, we're going to have to hypothesize an extraordinary evolutionary stimulation that began roughly 4 to 5 million years in the hominid line, our line of development. And I will lay out a scenario for you. You can sleep on it. We can argue it later. But this is my myth or my story or my attempt to shatter the Darwinian paradigm with a slightly different approach. Approximately 5 to 6 million years ago, a climatological process began in Africa, which is continuing at this moment, a slow process of drying. 7 to 5 million years ago, 90% of the tropical region of Africa was covered by a climaxed rainforest as dramatic and as species dense as the Rio Waijaga Basin, which is one of the most species dense regions of the Amazon, is today. But at some point, this drying tendency began to force the retreat of this rainforest ecosystem, and in its place was grassland and savanna. Now, our remote ancestors, like most animal species, had occupied an evolutionary niche and were very content to fill that niche and to maintain themselves there as canopy-dwelling, fruit-eating primates with a complex but not extraordinarily complex set of pack signals, as we see, for instance, in squirrel monkeys today and other tropical or other canopy-living socialized primates. Whenever a species feels its habitat under pressure, there is suddenly evolutionary opportunity for mutations which would previously be suppressed as inappropriate to, in fact, gain a certain currency within the population, if not an outright dominance. And our remote ancestors, faced with a retreating habitat, had two choices: extinction or expansion into a new habitat. And it was at this point in time that we began making brief forays out of the trees and exploring what had previously been, I'm sure, a very alien dimension to us, the forest floor and the adjoining grasslands. The other thing that can be said about almost all animal species is that they tend to specialize their diet. It's thought that the reason for this is it's a very good strategy for avoiding exposure to mutagenic compounds, to toxins which will break and rearrange chromosomes and that sort of thing. You know, most people believe, who've had, one or two courses in biology, that evolution is driven by mutation. We know that. But most people think that mutation is driven by incidental cosmic radiation reaching the surface of the planet in a fairly constant rate, offering up then mutations to the invisible hand of natural selection. That's true, but it's a facile truth. The reality is somewhat more complex. The real cause of mutation is stress, and incidental cosmic radiation is only one form of stress. Another form that I think has been highly overlooked in an attempt to understand the human predicament and human evolution is nutritional stress. That an animal whose habitat is undergoing a retreat in size, such as the retreat that these African rainforests experienced, will not only explore new environments, it will explore new dietary possibilities. Otherwise, you're going to die of starvation. Well, the plant kingdom has evolved all kinds of toxins in many chemical families in order to protect itself against predation and for various other reasons. So when you begin expanding your diet, or when our remote ancestors began expanding their diet, it was not only a matter of eating meat, it was a matter of testing many, many plants in the environment. And the consequences of this would be a sudden increase in the number of toxically induced mutations, all of which, without prejudice, are then offered up to the mechanisms of natural selection. As an example, which is not psychedelic, most of you probably know that birth control pills are the original source, and to this day much of it still comes from Dioscorea species, which are grown in fact on a mass scale in Mexico. Well, sweet potatoes are a very close relative of these Dioscorea vines, and sweet potatoes throughout the warm tropics are a major component of the diets of many human groups. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to imagine the consequences of a troop of primates chowing down on a patch of Dioscorea vines that are extremely heavy in compounds which affect ovulation, the estrus cycle, so forth and so on. I mean, basically genetic chaos would break out in that kind of a situation. And such situations probably occurred thousands of times over the course of several million years. That's a spectacular example and a fairly destructive one. I doubt that very much of evolutionary use to the human species arose out of interrupting ovulation and screwing with lactation cycles and this sort of thing through sampling of toxic plants. But at the same time, by chance or divine synchronicity, at the very moment that our remote primate ancestors were beginning to explore the spreading grassland environment in Africa, so too was evolving in that environment a number of ungulate mammals that are the remote ancestors of today's cattle. Bos primitivigensis, the proto-ancestor of Bos indicus, was one of these animals. And I'm sure I don't have to tell an audience like this that the manure of these ungulate, multiply stomached animals is one of the preferred environments for a number of psilocybin-containing species of Basidiomycetes, mushrooms. So that there's very little doubt that our remote proto-human ancestors would have encountered in the quest for an expanded diet along with poisonous legumes and all kinds of other toxic plants, they would have encountered psilocybin-containing mushrooms in their search for a new dietary equilibrium. And I maintain that psilocybin has characteristics which uniquely set it up for the compound which may well have worked the changes on an advanced bipedal monkey with binocular vision and a complex pack signaling set of pseudo-linguistic programs that would lead directly into the development of a species like ourselves. It goes like this. First of all, I mentioned the visual acuity thing. Our remote ancestors were omnivorous. This was one of the changes that went on. They were willing to accept not only insect protein, not only small birds, which may have been eaten for a long time in the canopies, but they were into running down small mammals and eating them. Well, it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to see that if there is a plant in the environment of an animal that lives by predation, and that plant will confer increased visual acuity, then those individual members of that species that will accept that plant into their diet will gain a slight advantage over other individuals of the species that are ignoring or treating this plant as though it were not a potential food item. Because visual acuity, it's essentially, the psilocybin was acting as chemical binoculars for these early hunting primates. Better eyesight means more successful hunts, which means more kills, which means more protein available to your offspring, which means a rapid outbreeding of those animals that will not accept this item in the diet. So that's the first stage of what I want to propose to you as a hypothetical three-stage process that would lead into the evolution of creatures like ourselves. It isn't dramatic. The next stage, however, is somewhat more dramatic. It is that psilocybin, like like most psychedelics, is what's called a CNS stimulant, central nervous system stimulant. Stimulation is characterized by what's technically referred to as arousal. We all know what arousal feels like. It's how you feel after 2 double cappuccinos. It's, an inability to sit still, a restless moving of your attention through the environment. You're antsy. That's basically it. You're also more likely to confront a physically superior opponent and launch yourself at them, whether this be a potential food source or a rival. It also, in highly sexed animals like primates, arousal means sexual arousal, erection in the male. And under the influence of psilocybin in this early proto-human environment, this would have led to what anthropologists delicately call more successful instances of copulation. That means sexual encounters which lead to impregnation of the female. So here's a second factor besides more success at obtaining protein, a second factor which would tend to promote the outbreeding of the non-psilocybin using members of the tribe. They simply were less interested in sex. Okay, now the other thing is, psilocybin in that kind of a situation, without the strictures laid on by tight sphinctered, later developed religions, leads to humping all in a pile. In other words, an orgiastic style is what you would expect to see in that kind of a situation. Now, this is important because the social consequences of an orgiastic sexual style is men cannot trace lines of male paternity. Men don't know who their children are. Women know who their children are because they see the child come out of their body. But men have no sense of their own children. They only have a sense of the group's children. It's a factor promoting community, you see. And at higher levels, and this is, I would argue, probably a unique characteristic of the psychoactive tryptamines, they promote pseudo-linguistic activity like glossolalia, bursts of linguistic-like vocalizations would have been common in these proto-hominid ancestors because they already had a complex pack control audio signal system that existed in the canopy. So I'm suggesting then that psilocybin was a kind of enzyme that accelerated certain tendencies in our remote ancestors that set them up to develop a very complex repertoire of audio signals, which required larger brain mass to process, and a style of socialization that, and this is the important part of the theory, that suppressed male dominance, that this orgiastic sexual style suppressed male dominance, and that over time a kind of paradisical world came into existence on the grasslands of Africa, where today there are howling deserts, some of the most extreme deserts in the world, the Sahara. As recently as Roman times, Pliny called the Sahara the breadbasket of Rome. That's only 2,000 years ago. 7,000 years ago, it was a grassland cut by many streams with wet uplands and rain-shadowed mountains, and a nomadic population of human beings that over time they started out traveling and following along behind these herds of ungulate mammals, probably living off lion kills by larger predators. But over time, a kind of pseudo-symbiosis took place between human beings, cattle, and, I would maintain, mushrooms. And the style of life was nomadic, orgiastic, communal, and dynamically in balance with the rest of nature. Now that's as much as I would say to a straight evolutionary biologist. But to you, I say, there was one other factor here, which is that at this high dose, higher than the dose that would make orgiastic activity possible, but a dose which makes sex unthinkable, where you're just nailed to the ground around the campfire, unable to move, at that dose, there is a connection into the gestalt totality of nature, which I call the Gaian mind. I don't think it's a religious hypothesis. I don't think it's a theological construct. I think it's a biological reality. It's the unity of nature. It's the seamless totality of meaning that we have completely lost touch with, we, 20th century civilization. And it's our lack of connection to this Gaian totality that permits us to participate in the murder of the planet. We are emotionally dead to what we are doing. If we could feel for a single moment the true nature of our circumstance, everyone would be an ecologist. Everyone would be concerned about the fate of the rainforest. But we have put in place a set of institutions that deliberately mask and suppress our connection into the Gaian mind because it would be so painful for us. 15,000 to 25,000 years ago on the plains of Africa, I think the human nature relationship existed in a wonderful dynamic balance that brought no disgrace to anyone. Well, so then the question becomes, so if it was so wonderful, what happened to it? Well, the answer is the very forces which created it destroyed it. They were forces of climatological change. Where there had been rainforest and then grassland, there came desert. And the spread of the desert meant the retraction of the habitat of the mushroom. And when the mushroom became scarce, so that it could no longer, these orgiastic get-togethers could no longer take place at every new and full moon as they had for perhaps 100,000 years, when that was no longer possible, the behavior, the tendency toward male dominance, which had been chemically, pharmacologically suppressed by psilocybin, it had never been gotten rid of. It was there all the time. And when the mushrooms receded, it must have been like hell on earth. It must have been somewhat like what we are experiencing in the 20th century. It must have been an experience of people becoming brutal, animal-like, capable of mass murder. People became, suddenly males became aware of male paternity, of turf battles, of classes, and all of this happened right at the moment that agriculture was born. Agriculture, I think, was the great bad trip in terms of human development, because what agriculture did was it ended nomadism, because agriculture requires a sedentary lifestyle. Agriculture as a strategy for food production is horrifyingly efficient, because what you do is you immediately produce surplus. In the presence of surplus, there is a tendency to create a have class and a have not class. Suddenly, surpluses must be defended. In the world of 10,000 BC, the most advanced structure on this planet was the grain tower at Jericho. It was a storage tower for grain, and it was constructed so that you could carry rocks on your back up to the top of it in order to drop them on other human beings who were trying to lay siege to your grain supply. So, put very simply, psilocybin, for the period when it was plentiful and in frequent use, suppressed ego, suppressed the sense of unique or individual identity, and substituted for it a kind of extended communal sensibility. And we, to this day, idealize this sensibility, but for 7,000 or 8,000 years it's been a dream, because hard on the heels of agriculture come walled cities, kingship, stratified classes, warfare, mass murder, mass graves, all of these things, and nothing has changed since. We have only elaborated the efficiency of our maladaptive behavior through a few wrinkles like the phonetic alphabet and materialism and that sort of thing. Well, what's the point of this? Simply that now we are in the terminal phase of this maladaptive mutation. We have perhaps 50 years, perhaps 30 years. It may be too late right now. Nobody knows the real consequences of the ozone hole. Nobody knows what we're going to do with all this toxic waste that's being generated. Nobody knows how we're going to control our population without stepping on the toes of extraordinarily powerful and fanatical religious hierarchies that rule the lives of hundreds of millions of people with an iron hand. Nobody knows how we're going to gently untie ourselves from the albatross of civilization without going extinct. But I suggest to you that the importance that I think most people here feel about the psychedelic issue is because this is not about instant psychoanalysis or better sex or getting in touch with Native American lore or any of those things. It is quite simply the pharmacological means to medicate out of ourselves the lethal style of existence that we have created for ourselves. As straight a person as Arthur Koestler, certainly no stoner, suggested in a book called The Ghost in the Machine that we are evolutionarily so hardwired for murder that the only way we will ever be able to create a caring civilization is through pharmacological intervention on these ancient reflexes. Well, essentially, I'm suggesting a more complicated version of the same thing. You know, we have many problems: toxic waste, population, misuse of land, suppression of other peoples and classes. But all of these problems, to my mind, can be reduced to a single problem: the overexpression of the individual ego. That's what it is. That's why we have worked ourselves into this impossible situation. And the only solution, I think, is to go back to the last sane moment the human family knew before we set out basically on the road to hell. And the last sane moment was about 15,000 years ago on the plains of Africa. In other words, before the invention of agriculture. We have to look very seriously about what was different in that lifestyle that we can institutionalize and inculcate into a global civilization of 4 or 5, 6 billion people. Obviously, we can't advocate orgies at the new and full moon, not with epidemic sexually transmitted diseases raging around the planet. However, I think we can take, for example, a hard look at the fruits of monogamy, and most importantly, I think we can take a very hard look at the cultural implication of psychedelic use. Most people talk about it in terms, and I do as well, in terms of individual right, human liberty, but it's a social obligation, I think, to try and find strategies to manage and erode the control of ego. A very powerful factor in global civilization that is pushing us all toward rack and ruin is materialism. The grip of materialism on the modern imagination has been achieved by convincing each and every one of us that you're nothing except for the things that you have. Psychedelic users know that the greatest riches lie right here. That's the counterpoise to Kmart and Costco and Yves Saint Laurent and Enzio Ferrari and all the rest of these people who trot out these toys that cause us to feel inadequate and incomplete unless we possess them. So I see the psychedelic thing as literally a fight for the life of not only the human species, but all life on the planet. Capitalism is not a user-friendly system. Capitalism will continue to extract metals and cut down forests and enslave third world populations until there is nothing left to cut down and nothing left to dig up. The psychedelic issue, it's always been such a puzzle to me why they attack it with such invidious fury, the institutions that seek to suppress it, because it's not like hard drug addiction. It's very, very manageable and mild in its effects on society, unless there is a kind of unconscious realization that the entire society is pinned together by a cult of ego, and that the psychedelics somehow erode and call into question this cult of ego. And so what I would leave you with tonight is simply the idea that I don't see us as involved in some kind of minor civil liberties issue where we are adjusting our right to experience yet more pleasures or more insight for our own self-satisfaction or aggrandizement. But very simply, we have to choose between this archaic, shamanic, non-materialistic, magical, female-oriented, gaian lifestyle, or we choose death for ourselves, our children, the rainforests, the oceans, everything. And, nowhere is it writ in adamantine that intelligence shall be preserved by the evolutionary process. 95% of all species that have ever existed on this planet are now extinct. You can see them, the hecodonts, the plesiosaurs, the great sauropods. All of these creatures are now simply locations in various shales and the stratigraphy of the geology of the planet. And it's, I think, incumbent upon anybody who feels any portion of this message to take a stand. It's not a stand for human liberty. It's not a stand for something as Western and recently invented as intellectual freedom or something like that. It's literally the life of all life on the planet depends on how we human beings come to terms with this maladaptive situation. Because you see, during the period when we were under the aegis of the great goddess and communicating with her through her sacred plants, that's when we invented community, loyalty, self-sacrifice, ethics, a sense of moral justice. It wasn't developed at Ur or Sumer or Babylon. I mean, those places outrage a sense of moral justice. It was developed in the archaic, shamanic, nomadic, gaian phase. And our nostalgia for that, it should be honored. It isn't an illusion of the human mind, as some historians have wanted to suggest, to believe that older is better. It is, in fact, an authentic memory of the last sane moment that we ever knew. And, you can commit suicide if you like, but making that decision for your children and their children and the children of all the other species on the planet is a crime for which there isn't even a name. So appalling is its magnitude. So that's really all I want to say. I mean, I could, pound the pulpit and claw the air, but I think that this is the single most important issue at large in the world today, and people such as ourselves who by good fortune and chance and synchronicity find ourselves on the fringes of this issue, or if agreeing in any small part with what I've said here this evening, there's a moral obligation to put this out in the marketplace of ideas. Millions of people, billions of people need the calming assurance that comes from experientially verifying the existence beyond the grave. And I think that at the end of history, this is what will happen, that very shortly the instability built into the system is going to transform material existence beyond all imagining. The culture, the global civilization is dying. There are too many problems. They're accumulating. You have to be blind to not realize that this is really, in fact, the end of the road, and that it is, the ozone hole, the toxic pollution, the toxification of the ocean. We can't pretend that these things are easily reversed by simply recycling or something like that. No, instead of this clutching to keep it all like it is and say, oh, no, no, please, no future, please, no future, we have to say, okay, deep breath. It's like that first wave of psilocybin when you feel it sweep over you, or ayahuasca, and you realize, my God, here it comes, I've done it this time. Well, we've done it this time, folks. We have been planning human mass suicide for 15,000 years. Not a moment was not dedicated to this goal, and now it's upon us. And it's a cause for great rejoicing. We will go off into hyperspace. The planet will heave an enormous sigh of relief. And if it can come back from an asteroid impact that leaves nothing larger than a chicken standing around, then I dare say in 50, 60,000 years, the glaciers will run, the jungles will restabilize, the ocean will cleanse itself, and as the I Ching says, no blame, no blame. The metaphor that we have to keep in front of ourselves, you all know the cliche, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, right? Do we all understand what this means?
No.
It means it's something that embryologists in the 19th century created, and I think it's fairly profound. It's that a fetus, a human fetus, recapitulates the entire history of evolution on this planet. It begins as a tiny one-celled organism, it becomes a fish, it becomes a reptile, it becomes a mammal, it becomes a human being, but the part of the recapitulation of phylogeny that we've ignored is extinction. For 1,000,000 years, we have been afloat in the gentling amniotic ocean of the planetary environment. Imagine the fetal crisis of birth. You exist as a fetus inside your mother. Food is delivered through the umbilical cord, oxygen delivered the same way, endless space, weightlessness, the dream, paradise. All needs are met. And then, something begins to go wrong. The walls close in. And you begin to be propelled into the birth canal. Strangulation. Death. The fetus must know at that moment incredible fear. Everything is going to be destroyed. The world is ending. Yet, how could the fetus at that moment imagine Hieronymus Bosch, or nuclear physics, or global politics, or starflight, or any of these things? We are now in the birth canal of a new ontological order of human existence, and the walls are closing in. There's no going back. The amniotic ocean, the unpolluted, endless frontier of a game-rich planet, forget it. We've been in the birth canal for 10, 15,000 years, and now we're approaching transition, the most violent part of the birthing process. And all you can do is scream unless you have some superordinate knowledge of what is going on. The shamans in the rainforest, shamans among us, and as a goal for each of us, must act as the midwives to a new order of existence. There's no going back. We've burnt this scene to the ground. And the womb is stretched, the womb is traumatized, but it can recover. But the child and the mother must be parted. Again, the metaphor of pregnancy. If a pregnancy is somehow if the birth is not smooth, if the child is not parted from the mother, toxemia sets in. And then you have a real crisis. The life of the mother, the life of the child, everything is in danger. This is the real problem. I don't think we've reached that place yet. I think that we'll go fairly smoothly into hyperspace, but I think the emergence in the last 20 years of masses of human beings taking psychedelics, masses of human beings talking about getting in touch with the spirit, talking about a new shamanism, an archaic revival, this means we are very, very close to seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. And it's a radiance, the meaning and the depth of which cannot be told, because we are, after all, being born into a higher dimension. But if we believe in the dynamics of nature, if we believe in the rightness of being, then there should be no anxiety. There should be no alarm. This is what psychotherapy and shamanism and all these things exist for, is to spread the truth about the situation so that we don't clutch and we don't hold on and spread panic and hysteria. And that's what I've learned from psychedelics.
To get to the spirit, I can't see for myself, I can't see bypassing the heart. But anyway.
Well, don't you think that the collapse of everything familiar is going to open our hearts? I mean, look at what AIDS has done. Look at what the information we have about the rainforest, or the pictures of Somalia. I mean, the most open-hearted of us open first. But before this is over, every one of us will probably bury the dead and walk through, hell, and it will open the heart. It can't fail to open the heart. I mean, when a friend dies in your arms, maybe the first time it doesn't work, but the second, the third, the fourth, we are going to get it sooner or later. And it's bigger than all of us. I mean, it's just so big. And it's always been there in miniature in the phenomenon of our own deaths. But we don't look at that. But, if you will contemplate your own death, your heart will open. I mean, the truth that I've learned from psychedelics, to put it into bumper sticker form, if that's the way to think of it, is this is the hardest truth there is. This is the distillation of 50,000 years of nomadic hunting and orgies around the campfire and rockets to the moon and the whole thing. It can be summed up in a single phrase: nothing lasts. Nothing lasts. Everything is changing into something else. Heraclitus said this. He said, "Panta rea," all flows. We flow into this world, we inhabit it, and we move on. Nothing lasts. Not your career, not your fortune, and finally not even your own sweet self. Everything is replaced. And if we can open ourselves to this by the heart, by the mind, I mean, there's all ways, then we will find the dignity to, and this is not about being born in the generation at the end of the world. This is something that would have worked at every moment in history. After all, Heraclitus lived 2,500 years ago. This is the truth of true maturity. Nothing lasts. I mean, every time I take a trip or eat a fine meal or make love or visit an art gallery, I feel the transience of it, and that enriches it. That's the heart dimension, is the poignancy of knowing that this too shall pass. This too shall pass. You know, the earliest piece of poetry in English is called Deor's Lament, and it begins, "9 winters we Elftheow held Marenglenberg. That now is gone, this too shall pass." It was a song sung by a poet to a king somewhere in France in the 10th century or something like that. Everything is in transition, and the material body resists this truth, because the material body understands that if it passes, then it will be replaced by something which it can't imagine, and that triggers an anxiousness. But I think this is what psychedelics teach, that nothing lasts, and if we can incorporate that and live it, we will live every moment to its fullest. People who are HIV positive, they get to walk around with the knowledge that nothing lasts, and in a way they are privileged, because after all, any one of us could be bitten by a snake today and die, or have a tree fall on us, or be run over by a bus. We would have missed living in that heartful dimension where you know that you too will move from the scene and make way for something else. William Blake said, nothing is lost. Nothing is lost, and I really believe that. I think we only move on. But William Blake, you know, this isn't the opposite thought, but it's an adumbration of it. He said, what is the price of experience? Is it bought for a song or sold for a dance in the street? No. It is purchased with all that a man hath. His children, his wife, his home. And that's the truth of it.